So again, we are happy to have Brianna Linden back for week 2 of Civics 101. I will, let me get your presentation pulled up.
Is it just behind it?
Yeah, just go up to, you'll have to go to share, to do a new share.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Share first. Oh.
There we go.
All right. Thank you all for coming back to the second one, or maybe this is your first one, but the last class we really talked about like overviews of things, and this time I wanted to dive directly into absentee voting, what it is, what it's not, and how it works. And I'm going to cover both Missouri and other states to kind of give a whole background of how the process works all across the country, and talk specifically later on about how it works here. It sounds really scary. People hear absentee voting and it could mean a million different things, but we're going to talk about the history of it, the different flavors of it, how they get counted, and then the effects on elections administration, because that's one of the areas that our office looks at when we're talking about election reforms or changes to how a process works. Has a big impact, kind of like a cascading effect on what we have to run in the office. So we will end with that part of it, because I know most of the questions are probably going to be in what are the different flavors, how do they get counted, all those sorts of things. So variations of absentee voting have existed throughout American democracy. There's like a history of them, that even in the 1700s, there was some variation of absentee voting, but it really didn't go all across the country until the Civil War. And that was so that military members could still vote in the presidential election. But absentee voting still means different things in different states. I put some resources up here, and we can share them after, but there's some really good work done by the National Council on State Legislatures, which is the NCSL link that's on there. They have a really great comparative report and tables, and a lot of the information we're going to talk about comes from that, because they're just a great clearinghouse for state statutes all across the country. And then there's also on here, I cited to an MIT website, because there's a group of researchers at MIT that have created this thing called the Election Lab, and they work almost exclusively on just ways to improve elections, how processes work, and trying to give some data-driven policy recommendations when it comes to voting. And the head of that MIT Election Lab has served on presidential election commissions before, so he's got some pretty good experience, even though he's never actually run an election. I still like him. He's a great guy. Part of the reason why there's so many different variations is that voter preferences have evolved over time. So you can see this chart is 1996 through 2022. And that red line at the top, that is people voting in person on election day. So we have been downward trending of nationally people casting ballots in person on election day. Well, you can see the blue is by mail, and then the yellow underneath is in person before election day. So that's in-person absentees, that's early voting, all those. Those trended up. 2020 obviously is an anomaly, because lots more people voted by mail and in person, and so you're going to see that kind of decline. It pops up in 2020 where it's talking about the mail, and then you see in 2022 it dropped back down again. But it didn't drop all the way back to where it used to be. There are still more people voting by mail in 2022 than their previous were in like 2018, 2016. So while we're seeing some bounce up, the trends are still going in that direction. It'll remain to be seen what happens in 2024, but this is where we're at right now. And this is going to be kind of grainy, so I apologize, but I made this into a GIF. The MIT group has created this, it's called the snow globe, which is why there's a little snow globe picture in the corner, but it's all the states, and it's like the three corners are people that vote on election day, people that vote by mail, and people that vote in person before election day. And it's called the snow globe because in the 90s, when they started evaluating this stuff, everybody, all of the states were all up in the top, and they just kind of shake down a little bit. So you can see more and more states have been having voters that have been wanting to vote by mail or voting in person. And the last one on there, the 2022 one, I'll let it go around again, shows a little trampoline with a snow globe on it, and that's because since 2020 was an anomaly, everything filtered down in 2020, and they kind of bounced back up in 2022 because people moved back a little bit more to election day. The types of absentee voting across the country. You've got excuse required, but by mail. You've got no excuse required by mail. You've got excuse required in person. You have no excuse required in person. You have straight up early voting. You have mail ballots to every voter. And then you have combinations. So there's no state that just does one of these. States have combinations of these, even in states that are considered like all mail ballots all the time, Oregon and Washington, things like that. They still have other variations in here. For example, we are all required by a federal law to provide military and overseas ballots to people by mail or by email or through an electronic portal. Everybody has to do that. So regardless of whether you're a mail-in state or an in-person state, we all have to do that for military and overseas voters. Has everyone heard of these before? Okay. So what this looks like in terms of distribution across the United States. 15 states have excuse required by mail, and there's going to be some crossover on this, but this is just generally. 15 states have excuse required by mail. 14 states have either a permanent or long-term absentee list for voters with disabilities. We fall into that category if you have a permanent or if you have a permanent disability, a permanent injury, you can sign up to be on this permanent absentee list. It doesn't mean you automatically get a ballot. It means you automatically get an absentee ballot request form, so you get an application, but you don't automatically get a ballot. 28 states offer anybody can vote by mail, you don't need a reason. And 8 of them have permanent absentee lists where you can sign up and automatically get ballots, not applications, but actual ballots, because you don't have to tell people why you are voting absentee. 46 states have excuse required in person. That makes total sense if you're thinking about it. If you're not going to be able to make it to an election, most all of the states are going to give you at least one opportunity to vote before election day. Most of them choose to make that an in-person option. Yes.
Where there's no excuse required that and you have a permanent vape, how do you decide whether that's the person who's voted?
So we will get into that because that's the same as, that kind of absentee ballot is the same as somebody that's out of town on election day that asks for an absentee ballot too. So the process, they treat them the same. Whether you're on the permanent list or on just a regular one-off absentee, the process is the same. 17 states have no excuse required in-person absentee, which is not quite early voting. There is still a difference. Sometimes it's the difference of, with early voting, you know what the results are throughout the early voting period. With no excuse absentee, you can't release those results until election day. 21 states and Washington, D.C. have some sort of early voting. And then 8 states in D.C. mail ballots to every voter. So this is kind of the distribution. It's not comprehensive, but this is kind of the distribution of what a voter would see in different places. Now this is like a wall of text, and so this is going to be more helpful if after the fact you want to review this on your own. But I just want to point out, voters are going to notice differences across states and even across different counties because the laws are different everywhere. Everywhere's got different time frames. Our absentee voting period is 6 weeks, but it starts 6 weeks before election day and ends the day before election day. Arizona starts 27 days before, but ends the Friday before Election Day, which makes you think like, okay, well then what do you do if you need to vote absentee on Saturday? You're out of luck. Available locations. West Virginia's early voting can only happen in a courthouse. Their law says it has to be in a courthouse or in the annex next to it. North Dakota, the local election authority can decide where they're going to have it.
So are you saying that early voting in Missouri is just absentee ballot?
So we technically don't have early voting. We have no excuse
So if
absentee
you
voting.
want to early vote, you have to get an absentee ballot?
Correct. So
Even if you're not absent?
yes, it's still called absentee because the term has just evolved over time.
You can walk right into Brianna's office and do that.
Yes. Times of day are different. If you're in Tennessee, the office has to be open a minimum, and this is, like, I put this in here specifically to be like, wow, that's crazy that the law is that specific, but it is. At least 3 consecutive hours on weekdays, Saturdays between 8 and 6 p.m., and on at least 3 days, offices must be open between 4:30 and 7 p.m., and on at least one Saturday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. in counties with a population of over 150,000 people. So that's how specific a lot of these laws get. The reasons for voting absentee can be really different. Again, in Tennessee, as long as you're over 60 years old, that is a reason to vote absentee. We don't have that in Missouri, but there's different variations in every state. The ballot return time is one of the things that catches a lot of people when they're watching natural results, because some states like Missouri, we require that the ballot has to be in our hands by 7 p.m. on election night. So we have to have them by the time election day is over. Alabama makes you have them received by noon on election day. So if you came in with your absentee ballot and said, oh, I forgot to drop this off today, and it was 2 p.m. in Alabama, they would say, no, you can't give that to us. Mississippi has a postmark deadline. So if in Mississippi, your ballot is received by the local election authority on Thursday after the election, totally fine, as long as the postmark date is at least on election day. So everybody's slightly different with that. That is what leads to things taking a little longer during the certification process, because if Mississippi has to wait for 5 days to see if they get more ballots, they can't certify their election or their results if they don't have all of their results in yet, because the ballots are still being cast. And then the last thing that is different depending on the state and makes a big difference as to whether something's going to be counted or not is whether a voter has the opportunity to correct a mistake on the return envelope. So in 30 states, if a voter makes a mistake, like they forget to sign the ballot envelope, they forget to put their first name or something like that, they just forget part of the information that is required to be on the envelope. 30 states require the local election authority to let the voter know that they did that, let them know that they made a mistake, and give them an opportunity to correct it. The time frame might be different. It might be that they have to correct it before election day, but sometimes they get a week or so to come into the office and correct it, just to make sure that the envelope is complete so the ballot inside of it can be counted. Side note, we are not one of those states. We are not obligated to let voters know that they mess up their absentee ballot. Their absentee ballot gets rejected if they forget to sign it. So we're kind of in the minority in that regard, but like I said, every state does something a little bit different.
Do the military ballots have to follow that same ballot return time?
For Missouri, they have to be postmarked on election day and received by noon on the Friday following the election. But only military and overseas. So what do we have here? We have excuse required by mail, we have excuse required in person, and we have no excuse required in person. So starting 6 weeks before election day, anybody that has a reason to vote absentee can request us to send them a mailed ballot, or they can come into our office. If they get to 2 weeks out before election day, which, like for the April 2nd election, that day will be next Tuesday, March 19th. then anybody can come in and vote absentee. That would be, I think for most people, they would think of that as early voting, because we don't have to do anything except come in, we check you in, you get a ballot, you vote. That's voting, right? But we don't technically have early voting. We have no excuse required in-person absentee voting, and that's how it's dictated in the state statute. So we can't really officially call it early voting because it's not early voting under the definition of what other states that have early voting would be. Somebody in the chat asked, for the correction, is this done only before the closing of polls, or can it be corrected after the closing of polls in the states that have it? It varies on how the states do it. Some of the states do give you the opportunity so that if you return your absentee ballot on election day and they find out, oh, you didn't fill this out properly, you can come back like Wednesday or Thursday after election day and still fix it. So that way, everybody's kind of treated fairly in the process and doesn't end up having, like, some people get notified that their ballot's not correct and other people don't. So,
What percentage of them do you find that there's been mistakes?
here, so the biggest mistakes that we find are that one of the requirements is that we have to have a notary. Unless you're voting because you have an illness or an injury. So people will forget to notarize it. Percentage-wise, I'd say it's not a ton. It's maybe between 5 and 10%. But the population of voters that it affects, well, the notary is a big deal. It's the people that are on our permanent absentee list that have a permanent illness or disability that end up being the ones that forget to sign it or are missing information. So that's been something, the ability to fix ballots and things like that. If you hear about ballot curing in the news, that's all that is. Ballot curing is just calling a voter and saying, hey, you messed up the envelope. You want to correct the personal information on your envelope? You don't touch the ballot? If you screwed up your ballot, like, that's a whole separate issue. If we process these ballots and you have filled it out totally wrong, circled things instead of filling in stuff, or you just like crossed stuff out, you don't get an opportunity to fix that. That's your ballot. You have cast it and it is out of your hands. But the actual logistical, like, envelope is kind of easy for people to screw up, to be honest, because and I'll show an image of it later. It's a very confusing, small, there's a lot of words, and it's all in like legalese.
As required by statute.
As required by statute. I would love to improve it. It'd be so great.
Over here.
Yes.
Oh, on the absentee ballot, or in person, as opposed to the early voting in other states, what is the difference? What do other states require that is different?
So the difference ends up being when the ballot is considered tabulated. So if you go into and it's a very finicky difference. It really has no meaning for voters. It just has to do on the administration side. For early voting, you can get early voting returns. And in some states, you can find out like, oh, this person's winning in early voting because they released the results through an ongoing basis. We can't release the results for no excuse. So if we've got, like right now, I've got 70 voters that have come into our office and cast an absentee ballot for the April 2nd election. I can't legally release those results until election night. But early voting, sometimes they can be released earlier.
Do you open those ballots then before election day?
We will get into that. I think somebody else over here maybe had a question.
Someone calls in and says, I need to have 100 votes. Can you get them for me?
No, I can't. Good question. So I'm starting with in-person absentee because it's the easiest to explain. There's like 7 slides that I've dedicated to the mail-in part because I think that that's where most people end up having questions. But for casting an in-person absentee ballot, As a voter, the first thing you need to do is check the calendar, and this is in Missouri, because we've got 6 weeks of absentee voting. And so for the first 4 weeks, you'll have to fit into an excuse category if you want to vote absentee. But for the 2 weeks immediately prior to the election day, voters don't need a reason to cast absentee. So you make your decision about when you want to vote absentee. You have to have a photo ID. So when you come into the office, you have to do you have to show your Missouri driver's license or a passport or a military ID. And then you get checked in, election judges and staff check in voters. Voters get their ballot, they fill it out, and they put it directly in the ballot tabulator. So it's just like voting on election day, which is why most people, I think of it as early voting. In practice, it tends to be like early voting, but it's just earlier and still technically called absentee. Somebody asked in the chat, do all counties in Missouri run their elections with the same laws? Yes, we are all using Chapter 115, which is the election law statutes, as our guide for how we are conducting the elections. So one of the interesting things about, like I said, sometimes things are different across states, sometimes they're different across counties. Missouri law gives us the option, if you cast an in-person absentee ballot, to either put that ballot in an envelope to be processed later or put it directly in the tabulator. Prior to 2019, when we bought new voting equipment that had the capability of handling a larger volume of ballots, we would have done the envelopes. That's what we did before. So the voter went through the whole process. We still got them checked in. But then the tabulation took so much longer because even though we had seen the person and they had shown us an ID and we had cleared all of the stuff, they had signed in, later on, we'd still have to open up the envelopes and process them just like we do with the mailed absentees. So it goes much faster now, and in-person absentee is just like a smoother process for voters too, because they don't have to fill out the envelope as well as their ballot. Casting a mailed absentee ballot, the first thing you're going to want to do is check if you're eligible. We have 6 reasons in Missouri that you can vote absentee. One of the changes to the law in 2022 increased some of the excuses. So absence is obviously the first thing that comes to mind since they're called absentee ballots. If you're not going to be in the county on election day, if you are incapacitated or confined due to an illness or a disability, or you're a caregiver of somebody that is incapacitated or confined, if you've got a religious belief or practice that prevents you from going to the polling place, if you're going to work as a poll worker, and then these are the new ones, if you're a first responder, if you're a healthcare worker, or if you're a member of law enforcement, then you're eligible to vote absentee by mail as well, or in person by excuse. If you're incarcerated, which always throws people because they think, well, if you're serving a sentence, you're not supposed to be able to vote. If you're in pretrial and you haven't been convicted of a felony yet, even if you're in jail, you can still vote. So incarceration is still a reason for voting absentee. And then we also have a state program called Safe at Home, which is for anybody that is a victim of domestic violence or has some reason why they want to keep their address confidential. So we've got a list of voters that we get from the Safe at Home program in the state that we don't even get their names. They give them a code, and that anonymous code is what they have as their voter registration. So if somebody asks us, because there's so much public information that's available, if someone asks us for a voter roll, those people are all marked as confidential so that their address is not revealed, just in case it compromises their safety. Yes.
And how do you, use the, photo ID, you know?
If you're in Safe at Home, when you vote, if you're in the Safe at Home program, you have to show your Safe at Home card that the state gives you, because that's got your code on it that shows your anonymous code. And then a poll worker will look that up, and then you still have to show a photo ID. So Safe at Home participants have to show 2 IDs. Not ideal.
I just want to say that is a very cool program. I'd never heard of that before, and that is very admirable.
It's run by the Secretary of State's office. Oh, somebody said it's difficult to hear. So somebody asked, the question was about the Safe at Home program and if they have to show photo ID, and yes, they do. The Safe at Home program was created well, I don't know if it was created in Missouri, but we were one of the states that implemented it. So it's really neat because other states will come visit the Secretary of State's office to learn how to implement it, because it's not just for voting. It also helps cover like your tax bills so that you can't be looked up on your taxes. Your deed, it can put in restrictions on your deed too. So that way they have some sort of protection in place for if somebody tries to use government lookup tools to find them. So once you have decided that you're eligible to cast a mail absentee ballot, the deadline for applying one is it's the second Wednesday before the election. So for the April 2nd election, that's next Wednesday. We have an online application on our website. You can also email a completed application to our office. You can mail one, or you can drop off a completed application. Usually, if people are dropping off a completed application, we tell them, you can just vote right now, and then you don't have to worry about getting it by mail. If somebody comes in, sometimes they're dropping off like somebody else's application, and that's fine. And we'll talk more about how we validate the applications. But once you have received the application, once you've received your ballot in the mail, and that's a picture of the ballot packet that you would get in the mail, you are going to fill it out and send it back to us, making sure that it's received in our office by 7 p.m. on election day. Most of the time, if you're not using that second excuse of incapacity or confinement, all the other excuses you're going to have to get notarized, so you'll have to take that to a notary. And once you have gotten it notarized, you can mail it back, or you can drop it off in person. It has to be by the voter themselves or by someone related to them within 2 degrees of consanguinity, which is pretty limited. It can be a spouse, it can be a parent, it can be a child, but it can't be like uncles or aunts or anything like that. Like, it has to be a pretty close to you family member. And they have to be related. If you have a caregiver and the caregiver tries to bring it back, they won't be allowed to give it to us. Any questions about that part? I know we're going to get more into some of the things that you may have questions about, but just generally. So is it safe and is it secure, and are they counted when we have these absentee ballots getting mailed back to us? And yes, the answer is yes. This is the request for an absentee ballot form. If you have ever requested one, you have to fill out all of this information, pick your reason for voting absentee, fill in the last 4 digits of your social security number, your date of birth, and then you've got to sign it. So the first protection that we have is that we're not automatically sending ballots anyway. Voters have to apply to get one. So you won't have one just show up in your mail. If you have something show up in your mail that you're concerned is a ballot, always call our office, because sometimes campaigns will send out stuff that look very official. If you have not asked for an absentee ballot, the other thing that we do is if you call and ask for an absentee ballot, like, all of that is kept. So in case there is something that happens where you're like, I really don't remember casting an absentee ballot, we can pull out the form and you can look at it and make sure that it was yours. So voters have to apply. The application asks for all that identifying information in a signature. And the reason for that is because that information is checked and verified against your voter registration record. So if you send one in and it's got a totally different address than we have ever seen on your voter registration record, we're going to reach out to you and ask if you meant for this to be a change of address as well, if that is the correct address. We have, like, the absentee voting process requires a lot of back and forth from the voter in our office, because if something comes in that's questionable, we're going to be reaching out. That's also why we ask for phone number and email, because we use it a lot. Yes.
Is there any idea how many people just give up on it and don't vote?
Like when they're trying to request this, if it's too frustrating?
They might try and then they forget about it or something, but they just don't vote. You lose the vote of what percentage of the population?
I'd say we have a fair amount. Like, if we're talking about the number that get requested but don't get sent back to us, we get a fair number of them that Sometimes it's because they want one, they don't know what's on the ballot yet, but they know they're eligible, so they request one, and then they get it, and they're like, I don't care about any of this stuff, I'm not gonna vote. So they just don't send it back. I think that happens a fair amount for the local elections especially. So we will probably have like a good percentage of returned absentee ballots to us is usually like 65%, 75%. That means that 30% of the people that asked for a ballot had no interest in casting it, but they asked for a ballot anyway. On the technological side, a voter's registration record, when we're processing these applications, gets marked as absentee requested. And that designation carries through when we're loading up our poll books, when we're checking in voters. Next to the name of the voter, if they've requested an absentee, it's going to say absentee requested, and that's going to prompt the election judge to call our office and say, this voter says that they requested an absentee ballot, but now they don't want to use it. What do you want us to do? And then finally, when the mailed ballot goes out, it has a tracking number on it so we can watch it move through the Postal Service. So when we send out absentee ballots, we have tracking on them that show when it gets scanned into the post office, when it gets delivered to your address by the post office, and then when it goes back out in the mail. So we can track these at any given time. That is something, like I said, county differences, that is something that we have because we have created that with our vendor. Not every county has that. Many counties do not have that because they either don't have enough absentee ballots to make it work, or they just don't have the resources to be able to do it. Yep.
You said vendor. You mean vendor just to print up
Yes.
sheets?
Our
You
ballot.
don't outsource any of that.
Well, our printer prints the absentee ballots on demand
Right.
and then puts them in the mail.
Members for the-
Yes.
But that's where their participation stops. Everything else is,
Right.
any questions go to you.
Yes, they don't do anything that we don't ask them
All
to
the
do.
paperwork goes to you. It doesn't go back to the original vendor.
Yes. So the vendor is our ballot printer. It's the same printer that we use that prints the ballots that we use on election day. So do other states do this process? With 24 of them, they take those applications and they compare the application information and eligibility against the voter record. We're on that list too. We're one of the 24. 11 have an additional formal signature verification requirement. So while we check the signature and while most of the counties that I know of check the signature, we're not legally required to check the signature. We do that because we want to make sure that we're absolutely certain that that came from the voter, but the statute doesn't say we have to do that. 11 states have a statute that says you also have to do that. Now, for the states that have formal signature verification processes, they often use software to do that. So it's not always people looking at two different signatures. They run it through signature verification software. That software will flag any of them that don't appear to be correct signatures, and then that moves them to a second process where then human eyes are looking at it to make sure that the software didn't mess up. 4 states require voters to submit a copy of an ID with the application. Alabama, Kentucky, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, you have to not just provide an application, but also a copy of your ID. Mississippi doesn't check any information. They're just happy if the application's notarized. South Carolina is happy if the voters sign an oath that they are who they say that they are. And then, but 4 states in Washington, D.C. issue the ballot upon receipt of the application, and the law is just silent on what they check. So I will say from experience and knowing what we have in Missouri and from talking to other county clerks, when the statute's silent, it doesn't mean that nothing is happening. It means that you're just going to have to rely on informal best practices to do what you're supposed to do. So we obviously do the information and eligibility check, but we want to go farther and do signature verification as well.
Is there a cost for notarizing?
It is for, if you're in Missouri, and this is where it gets tricky, because if you're voting absentee because you're like in Illinois, this won't apply. If you're in Missouri and you ask to have something notarized and it's an absentee ballot, they have to do it for free. Unfortunately, we get people that call from like Illinois where they're getting charged to have it notarized, and we're like, well, Missouri law doesn't apply to an Illinois notary, so if they're gonna charge you, we can't really do anything about it. So, like I said, this is what it looks like when you get an absentee envelope in the mail. You can see why it might be difficult for people to fill out everything particular because you're not really sure what's important and what's not. We have tried to highlight it to make sure it's important. But man, the number of them that come back without that top yellow one where it's just your name. You just put your name in. I blank, put your name in. People don't. So, we've tried to make it really, really obvious because there's some grace in our law where if they forget to check one of those reasons, that's okay, we can still take it. However, if the reason they were gonna vote was because they were incapacitated or confined and they don't check that on here, then we're gonna have to assume that they were supposed to have it notarized. And if they didn't have it notarized, then they're missing something and then we can't count the ballot. So while it's really good for people to like fill out all of it, I can also see why this is not the world's greatest envelope. But when it comes back to us, the voter has to sign it, and then the signature is going to be checked against the voter's registration record. That's another one that we are not required to do, but we do anyway because we think it's important. The nice thing is we can check it against the voter registration record and the absentee ballot request. So the application and we have all of that at our disposal in the voter registration record. The ballot envelope, when it comes into our office, is time-stamped, and then it's logged in the voter registration system as received, and then it's locked in a ballot box. So as they come in, they get turned into batches. Those batches are then logged into the voter registration system. They are rubber banded together and then put into a locked and sealed ballot box. And then the voter registration record that before was set to absentee requested is then updated to absentee received. That designation also carries over into our poll pads. And if that designation is on there, they don't get to vote at all. So an election judge will call us sometimes and say like, this says absentee received, and they want to, they're not sure if they received it or not. And so we double check. We haven't had a bunch of people that have like shown up and tried to test that it really works, but it does work. So we make sure that the voter's record is up to date every step of the way. And then the return ballot also has a tracking number, so voters can see when the offices received the ballot. So part of the absentee ballot packet is that there's a code on there that says, here's your tracking code. If you want to track your ballot, you can put that code into the website, which is booneballottracker.com. And then you can see if it's been received yet by the post office, going through the process, or received by our office. Now, the thing about it being received by our office is that doesn't mean it's counted. At this point in the process, we're just talking about, do we physically have your ballot? If we physically have your ballot, we're going to mark you as received. We haven't even gotten to the counting part yet. This is literally what happens every day of the 6 weeks absentee period.
If there's a voter initiative that people are asked to vote for, how does this process fit in with that?
If there's a voter initiative that people want to sign?
Yes.
Well, the core information, the voters' information and their signature are also used. The voter registration database is the source of information for checking signature verification on the petitions. So it's still related to it, but it's not exactly part of the process, but we still use the core information like the voter information and the signature to do the checking. Yes.
How many people do you have in your office to do all this checking?
We've got a full-time and one full-time and one part-time staff that work on the absentee side of things. So absentee voting from the administration side is really interesting because it's such a narrow period of time. that the fact that all mail ballot requests, those applications have to be in by next Wednesday, and we still have 2 weeks to go before the election, means that they have 2 weeks of time to sort through everything, make sure that everything's checked and all of that. So one of the fortunate things about the way Missouri's law is orchestrated is that we have good timing to be able to take care of everything and count them, which not every state has. And I'll go into that in a little bit too.
It must have been really interesting during the pandemic when all these other, that's the only time in my life I ever voted absentee.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, so I imagine you had quite a number of.
We brought on a lot of part-time staff during the pandemic to get through this and the in-person. In Boone County, we had 28,000 absentee votes. Half of them were people that wanted mailed ballots and half of them were people that were in person. And that's a lot what I want to talk about with the resource allocation and the impact on elections administration is the more that you've got different methods for voters to use, the more resources you have to put towards all of them somewhat equally because voter behavior is not predictable. So essentially, now that we've got 2 weeks of no excuse absentee voting and mail and election day, we're running 3 elections. Even though it's 1 election, we have to put the same kind of resource intensity into all of them. Any other questions? Okay. Now I'm going to get into more interesting parts of what other places are doing too. So when those ballots come back, like I said, we do the signature verification. We're not required to, but we do. We want to make sure that the person actually was the one that cast the absentee ballot. 31 states are required to do signature verification. Just like with the verification that they do on the absentee ballot applications, this is usually a software system that they're using for the first pass and then a set of eyes if something fails. 10 states and DC verify the absentee ballot envelope has been signed. Some of them also require them to submit their driver's license number. We don't have any of that information on our absentee ballot envelope. One of the reasons for that is what you saw on the envelope, all of that information is on the outside of the envelope. There's no additional envelope. So when it's going through the mail, that's all for everybody to see through the mail. If we asked you, like in Connecticut or in Georgia, to put your driver's license number on, we might have to add another envelope. And so some of these other states that do it that way, where they're putting more personal information on there, have a 2-envelope system. And that's where some of the mistakes you see in other states happen, where you hear things like, there's this privacy sleeve, and if you don't put it in the privacy sleeve, it's not going to be counted. It's because there's so much personal information in them, they have to put them in different envelopes. Ours is just 1 envelope, the ballot goes in the envelope, it comes back to us. 7 states require a witness to sign it, so they don't need a notary, but you do need a witness. So if you live alone, it can be difficult. And then 3 states, which is we're one of them, require the ballot envelope to be notarized. So we are in the extreme minority in that, primarily because signature verification in the election world has really increased in popularity. So people have said notarization is fine, I guess, but it's not nearly as effective as conducting signature verification. So that's why the vast majority of the states do signature verification. We sort of do both, but we don't, because it's not required, it doesn't make sense for us to invest in signature verification software or anything like that. Ours is done visually by staff in our office. Yes.
If someone can't do their signature, they've forgotten or they can't mechanically do it, does that kick them out of the system?
No, so they just have to sign with an X or some kind of mark. And also it's definitely really hard to see on this, but the words that are running up and down the side or sideways are specifically for people that are providing assistance. So if somebody helps you fill out your absentee ballot envelope and signs your name for you, they fill this out and say, hey, I'm the person that did it and this is my name and I'm signing it. If they just make a mark, if that is what they've always done, so if we have an absentee ballot application with a mark and a voter record with a mark, that's totally fine.
Do you send out anything specific to colleges and universities, like to administrators or individual students who are moving back and forth?
So we do provide a lot of like voter registration information and things like that, where we run into not finding a great way to communicate absentee information is that if somebody's going to vote absentee at the college, they more likely than not are going to vote in another state absentee, and we don't want to give them the wrong information if they need additional resources or things. So we provide information to tell them, like, we can notarize your ballots if you need that, we can help you like navigate the system, but we are not experts on all of them. We can just tell you what Missouri needs. So then how do these get counted? The in-person absentee ballots are obviously like the easiest ones because they are cast exactly like they get cast on election day. The tabulator itself has all of the ballots in the bottom of it. All of the results are on the USB stick that's in the machine, and so the USB stick is pulled out of that and put directly into the tabulating computer. And so those get pushed right in. In-person absentee ballots, super fast, the first ones that are uploaded usually into our system. Mailed absentee ballots in our office. We have time before Election Day to be able to start preparing those ballots. So bipartisan election judge teams, and this is true for all states or for all the counties in Missouri, bipartisan election judge teams can come in and prepare the ballots. What that looks like is that our team checks the ballot envelope against the log of received mailed absentee ballots. That's what's happening in that picture. That blue piece of paper is the list of all of the ballots that were checked in that batch. And then the person that has the blue paper is saying the name of the voter. The person that's holding that ballot is checking that that ballot exists in the batch and the name is correct and all of that. Once they have checked to make sure that that is in our system, they open the envelope and they remove the ballot from it and they keep them separate. They don't look at what the ballot says or anything. They just put them in two separate piles. When they're done processing batches, that stack of ballots is then locked and sealed in a ballot box until Election Day. And then on Election Day, those ballots have not yet seen a tabulator. So we just have all of these ballots that have no results on them, no results counted yet. So we have a high volume ballot tabulator that we use in the office, which is exactly the same as the tabulator that you see at the polls, except that it can feed more through at one go. So we run all of those through on Election Day, and then the results are tabulated after the polls close. So those are how the two types of absentee ballots end up getting tabulated together at the end of the night. Military and overseas ballots are also prepared by bipartisan election judge teams, and they're counted in the same way. With military and overseas, people are getting their ballots not necessarily mailed to them in the traditional ballot format. They might get it emailed to them. And if it's emailed to them and they print it out, we have to have a bipartisan team recreate the ballot on a real ballot so that we can feed that through a tabulator. So a military member could literally write, here's who I want for president, here's who I want for state senate, here's who I want for a state representative, and then they can mail that back to us, and that's officially their ballot, but we're gonna have a bipartisan team make those marks that they have indicated on theirs, and then that becomes their official military overseas ballot.
And that has to be mailed, it can't come back to you email?
There is one group that can email back the military and overseas ballots, and that is anybody that isn't considered a hostile zone. For Missouri, that's traditionally been anybody that gets like hazard or duty pay in a particularly hard to reach area of the globe. So it's rare. In 2020, we did have that kind of expanded, and so every military and overseas voter could email back their ballot. But that was in part due to the concern that the postal union was going to collapse in 2020. And so they were afraid that if people were required to mail back the ballots from like Australia or Germany, they weren't gonna get back here.
Question.
Yes.
When you separate the ballot from the envelope and you lock up the ballots, what do you do with the envelopes? Do you destroy them or are those safe?
No, those are safe too. So every one of the envelopes, and it's hard to see. Let's see. I don't think it's obvious on this one, but I will just show you. In the upper corner of this envelope, like up in that corner, we have a little hole punch. And the reason for that is to make sure that we know that we've removed the paper from inside of it, so there's no ballot sitting in it. The hole punch is also helpful because then when we stack up the envelopes themselves, we could put like a zip tie through it to know that that is the stack of ballot envelopes. So we don't store them in a way that you could ever marry the ballot cast with the ballot envelope again, but we keep all of the absentee ballot envelopes for at least 22 months. They are sealed up with all of the rest of the documentation of the election. Okay. Okay. So do other states follow these processes too? For preparing the absentee ballots, this is another reason why you might see some states taking forever to get back their results. Michigan is a really great example of this. So while 39 states allow local election authorities to start processing absentee ballots before Election Day, that includes us. And the processing is just like, oh, okay, this ballot is here, it's supposed to be here, we're going to take the ballot out and put it over there. We can start doing that the Thursday before the election. 8 states and Washington, D.C. don't let people start doing that process, so not even counting it, but just validating things until Election Day. And so that's one of the reasons you see Pennsylvania, Michigan, places where you've got people that are voting by mail, and they have been doing more of that because they like voting by mail. The law has not caught up to meet the demand of how many mailed ballots they really need to go through. So if they've got all of their results done, but they're like, I still have 2,000 ballots that aren't counted, and that's going to swing a race. Once Michigan starts processing, they're also not legally allowed to stop. So some of these states are processing 24 hours a day once they start doing it, which is not ideal. And a lot of the local election authorities in these states have been trying to get their legislature to offer more like what we do, which is give us some more time to prepare them. Maryland's is even trickier because they're not even allowed to process absentee ballots till 10 a.m. on the Thursday after the election. So my colleagues in Maryland are really unhappy that they can't get that changed. And then Connecticut and Ohio leaves it totally up to the local election authority. So if you've got a local election authority with like 100 ballots, they might be fine waiting until Election Day. If you've got one with 15,000, they want to get a head start, they can do that. The law allows them to do that. For counting them, so preparing them is literally just making sure they're ready to be counted. The actual counting can't start until polls close in 15 states and Washington, D.C. 24 let local election authorities start on Election Day, but before the polls close, and that's us. So that's why we start counting at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Election Day. We have a bipartisan judge team in our office observing and participating in the absentee ballot counting process. And then 10 states allow the processing and the counting to happen before Election Day. So not only have they been able to process them and put them in the piles of envelope versus ballot, they can take all those ballots and run them through the machine. They might not be able to report out those results. They still have to keep them to themselves, but that way they're even through the tabulator by election night. So Arizona, Colorado, it shouldn't be a surprise the ones that have really high volume mail can do it in advance. So that way they're caught up with every other state by the time we get to Election Day. Utah is a great example too. They've had vote by mail for over 10 years. And this way Utah returns its results at the same time everybody else does. and you wouldn't know that they were processing mailed ballots the entire time. Are there any questions on those things? Kind of blew through this, so a lot of it, we might just have more conversations about. Yeah.
The counting of these ballots ahead of time and processing, is there some concern that the results of that would influence the people who are going to vote?
Like if the results get released early?
Yes.
Yes, that's a great question. So the question for the people on the chat, the question was, can it have an impact on voters that haven't voted yet to be able to see the results of early voting if those results are released? And I think that's absolutely the case. That's the argument for why we keep our results secret until election day is over at the end. It used to be that when we weren't using tabulators and everything was done by hand, it would have been impossible to require everybody to get election results by like 9 o'clock at night if all they were doing was hand counting them. And so it used to be that people could start counting throughout the day, and then those would be live numbers. And then the election judges would sometimes tell their friends what the results were at the polling locations, and that would kind of spread among people, and they'd be able to tell them, like, which is exactly why we have moved the other direction, because in the time of like political bosses, they would call up whoever that they knew needed to win and say, you need to send 15 more voters down here, my guy's down by 15, and we need to get 15 more ballots cast for them. So that was absolutely a thing that happened. That's exactly what Pendergast used to do in Kansas City. And that's why we've moved in the direction of you can't release the results. We don't even necessarily want the election judges knowing what the results are on election night. I mean, they do. When the polls close, they know what the election results of their poll are because they see it and then they bring it back to our office. But they are not allowed to disclose that. In the short ride that they're coming back to our office, they can't call their friends and be like, oh, guess what happened? It all has to be embargoed until we're putting out results after 7 p.m. Yes.
So there's a new word that came up recently, harvesting.
Yes.
So are you going to get to that, or is this the same thing of how do you monitor partisans that are harvesting?
Yeah, so, and let me go back to a particular slide, because I did this kind of purposefully just to avoid buzzwords. But for returning your ballots, it's not on this one particularly, but where we were talking about in Missouri in particular, here we go, can be mailed or dropped off by the person or by the voter or someone who's related. When people talk about ballot harvesting, that's the area that they're talking about. So they're talking about one person going around and collecting everybody in the neighborhood's ballots and bringing them into the clerk's office. Our law doesn't allow that to happen because you have to be the one that provides it back to our office. In the states that, and I will keep referring to it as ballot harvesting just because that's the easiest one to understand, but let's say the arguments that have been made, well, somebody's doing that, but then they put them in a drop box, so you don't know. The states that have drop boxes are also required to have 24-hour surveillance on them. So when there have been instances of a campaign doing that, which it's usually a campaign that's trying to round up everybody, and sometimes they mean well, sometimes they're just like, hey, we know this person is homebound and we're just trying to do them a solid and return their ballot for them. Still not great, but they're required to have all of these security devices on the actual ballot drop boxes themselves to catch if that is happening. And then they investigate who did it and why they did it and things like that.
It could easily be a mailbox, couldn't it?
It could be, yeah. Which is part of the reason why it gets a little weird when you start talking about the difference between a ballot drop box and a mailbox, because in the laws that have ballot drop boxes, they have all these security things, but none of that on the mail. And we have in this state, I think it would be very hard to it would be very hard to harvest ballots anyway, because there's so many different, it would be really weird if all of a sudden we had like 10 show up on the same day from very disparate places, because we'd be like, this doesn't seem like it should normally happen. And in places where that's happened, like St. Louis City, it happened in previous elections where they were rounding them up, and then they would drop them off at the county clerk's office or the Board of Elections, and then they would just leave. They wouldn't even talk to somebody that worked there. They would just drop ballots and leave, because they knew if the ballots were there, what are you going to do? Not count them? Like not accept them? The ballots were there. So there are definitely situations where those kinds of things can happen. They get prosecuted after the fact, and we can go through still, even if all those ballots were dropped off, we can contact all those voters, and we would, and ask, did you cast this ballot? How does this, like, walk through the whole process with it to figure it out, and then figure out how we can fix it usually with the assistance of the Secretary of State's office.
Along those lines, let's say you have an assisted living facility or a place, where there's like, are those people allowed to bring the ballots of everybody who's in that facility, or do they have to arrange for their individual relative to take care of it?
So the one area that I didn't talk about is the people that are in assisted living facilities. Those folks are often served by bipartisan judge teams that go out to vote people. There's a special section that says that if you want a bipartisan election judge team to bring your ballot to you because you're confined or you have a disability, then we can do that. And for any place that we get more than 10 absentee requests from at the same time, we have to go out and send a team. So we basically just create a little mini election day for them, we get the list of all the people that want to vote absentee, and then we bring them out and vote them right there. So they don't have to worry about it. Any other questions on these parts? Yes.
For those people, like, well, my husband was living at Lenore for a while. So there's people at Lenore want to vote absentee. Do they use their home address or where they always lived, or their
So it would be whatever address they consider to be their residential address. So if they're residing at Lenore and they update their voter registration to reflect that they're residing at Lenore, then that would be both their voter registration address and their mailing address.
but they don't have to.
No, I mean, if they're not, like with Lenore in particular, sometimes people are just doing rehab there and then going back home. They can keep their residential address at their home address and then have a temporary mailing address. We have that. It's very common with absentee voting. All right, so for effects on elections administration, and I was alluding to before, running essentially 3 elections at the same time, but every form has its own administrative and resource needs. And this is where it can be easy to kind of take advantage of that fact and cast aspersions on other states, which I have tried to rein myself back from doing, because with 2020, everything scaled up with mail voting, with absentee voting, with in-person absentee voting. And a lot of states that had 0 experience ever doing it before were then thrust into, all right, fine, spin up a mail ballot program. How are you going to do that? You got 3 staff that work for you full time. You're a small town in Massachusetts. What are you going to do? And for a lot of them, they really drowned. A lot of them found a lot of temporary people and got it done. But it didn't mean that the process itself didn't look real rough. So when you're looking at places that are, Michigan's another great example, their whole election administration system changed because they had an initiative petition-led reform where it increased absentee voting, it increased early voting, it put a bunch more duties on the local election authorities, and it just kind of came overnight. The ballot measure passed and they didn't have any time to figure out how to implement it. So they're still working through a lot of those pains, but just some of the things that have to happen when you're thinking about election day. You're gonna need election judges, you're gonna need polling places, you're gonna need people to staff it, you're gonna need machines, you're gonna need ballots. Early voting requires mostly the same thing. You're still gonna need election judges to check in voters, you're still gonna need ballots. So you need them earlier in the process, so you no longer have that whole runway to get all the way to election day. But on the flip side, you're spreading out the risk, because if somebody has to vote only on election day, they run out of opportunities to be able to fix problems with their voter record or something like that if they don't have early voting as an option. And then mail-in absentee, if you start factoring that in, requires printing and postage, and then election judges after the fact to process all these things. So every system has different pain points and different resource needs. The thing that makes it the most complicated is that anticipating what voters want to do can make it really tricky, and then you've got a lot of financial constraints at the county level. Elections are not funded by the federal government. Most of the time, they're also not funded by the state government. We get reimbursed for some things, but our general budget is controlled at the county level. So if Boone County has other things it needs to prioritize, if I ask them for a new machine that is going to stuff envelopes for me that costs $40,000, they're going to say, I don't think we're going to give you $40,000 to do this thing for 3 elections a year where you only have 5,000 ballots that are going to go out. Because that's the reality of it. But that doesn't mean that stuffing those 5,000 ballots by hand with the staff that I have is any easier. So that's when you start talking to other counties, seeing what they're doing to make things more efficient, and then trying to get as many different ideas of how to make the process better as you can from other places. So, yeah, the big thing with the voter preferences anticipation is that percentage-wise, and this is the situation that we're in Missouri right now, percentage-wise, I'd say 90% of the people that vote in Missouri still vote in person. That was different in 2020. About 70% of the people that cast a ballot in person in 2020. And while we have gone back now to like that 90%, it's not quite the 90% that it used to be. Now it's more like 85%. Some people want to do more absentee because they found out how easy it was. Some people wanted to do the in-person no excuse because they found out how easy it was. But then you're running an election where 80% of the people are going to vote in person and 10% are going to vote in person before election day, and the other 10% are going to vote by mail. And you still have to put the same amount of work into making sure the mail program works, regardless if you have 5 voters or 5,000 voters. So it's kind of it's an interesting time to be in Missouri elections, because some counties, their constituency has no interest at all in voting in-person absentee. And in some counties, the clerk doesn't have any interest in doing in-person absentee, so they don't advertise it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means people don't know what their options are. So full circle, bringing it back to that chart that I put in just the very, very beginning, we are still in a state of flux all across the country about how people want to cast their ballot. And my goal for this class and just having this conversation, which we still have a couple minutes left, is just to think about, you know, if you have not voted absentee before, if you have thought about voting absentee before, to give you some context for what happens when you do vote absentee and how the process works on the back end too. Because I know I can't even convince my own dad to vote absentee. He wants to vote in person. That's fine. I get it. I did convince my mom to be a poll worker, so we got that going.
50-50.
But, you know, we are seeing these trends change, and I don't know what it's going to look like this year. I don't know what it's going to look like as we go, you know, past 2024, but we're in an area of more options. People want more options, and this is what it is.
Do you foresee internet voting ever being?
God, I hope not. For the people on the, virtually, somebody asked about, online voting. And I don't think we are anywhere close to online voting. There are definitely people still looking into it, and there's a, military voters emailing their ballots back is right at the edge of online voting, but it's not tabulated online. I think the biggest thing that hangs people up is the thought that everything is counted online too. Just having ballots online, okay, I mean, the sample ballots are all online. You can print out a sample ballot, but you can't cast it. We're not gonna let you cast that thing. But to count things and then not have a paper trail makes me very nervous.
Are there opportunities, given those costs of those sorting machines and all that stuff, of like school districts when they reorganize of counties, somehow sharing some or all functions, multiple counties?
So that's something that we've sort of broached in our association. And that's, I'd say, that's been successful in things like, mail services, for example, like leveraging the fact that we all have to mail out absentee ballots at the same time so we can get a lower postage rate. That's great. We've been able to do that. But when it comes to like actually sharing services, I haven't seen anybody do it successfully, which is not to say that we can't. I think everybody just does things so differently. We all use different machines, for example. There's not a lot of consistency when it comes to the detail work. So like I could tell people, hey, I'll print all your envelopes for you. You don't have to worry about it at all. We'll cover you. You've only got 10,000 voters. That's only going to be like 100. That's great. But that clerk who's also independently elected would be like, I don't like the design of your envelope, so I don't want you to do that. We run into that pretty frequently, which I do that too. St. Louis County, I see their template for how they want their absentee ballot envelope designed, and I go, that's not gonna work for Boone County. I need to make something totally different that we have tested in Boone County and works better. So I think it would be there. I think it would have to probably be legislated, which I also wouldn't be super sad about if we could legislate some efficiencies.
I think it's really important that, because you hinted at this, but you haven't really said this. There's a clerks association where statewide, these guys get together and what works for me, what doesn't work for me, what kind of problems did I have, how did they handle it? There's county commissioners associations, the clerks feed that information. I mean, it's a collective process, and yet it isn't by each individual county controls how they run that specific election office. But I'll use the word, it's a collaborative process. At least you're not in a tunnel.
Right.
You have the opportunity to see what's going on around you, what other people are doing, and make locally the decision that works best here.
Yeah, and it is extremely collaborative. So the association, the Missouri Association of County Clerks and Election Authorities, I have never worked in a more cooperative field. There is absolutely no competition. Everything is all about, let me show you what I can do and you can steal it. I have no problem if you steal it. And we've been going through that. We've been training our election judges this past week, and we have some new things that we've added in, like literally just checklist changes where we've been like, wow, we saw them doing that over in Cape Girardeau and thought it would be a good idea. So it's absolutely great from that perspective, but for actual, getting the job done, we have not gone as far as to be able to solidify. We even tried with RFPs. The state created an RFP for us as a stock document to use to buy voting machines, and nobody uses it. Because we're all like, we have more requirements than that. We don't want to just stick with what the state has. We all want our own.
How much of this is directly on your shoulders for the whole process, like getting the judges placed and the machines placed and setting up all the different precincts? Is that
100%.
100% directly responsible for all of it?
Yep. Some of these states, some of the states that we talked about in here have Yeah, and I might put that in a different, I might put that in our last class, just to talk about the different ways that elections administration actually happens, because some of these states that have different timeframes and different locations have a board of elections. So they've got like a three-piece elected board that is dictating things, which we actually have sort of in Missouri too. Board of Elections in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Kansas City, Jackson County. They've got a governor-appointed board that hire a Republican and Democratic set of directors, and those directors call the shots on day-to-day, but the board's ultimately responsible. So some states have something like that. Some states, the job is combined with the DMV. So like in Michigan, the clerks that are doing election stuff are also doing DMV work, because it's Michigan, and car manufacturers have a important lobby there, so they just smushed all of that together. So yeah, the process of administration is very different. In Missouri, we're very individualistic.
Have you had any problem with chosen election judges being intimidated or afraid of coming in because of threats or other things like that?
So we haven't had any threats, but the fact that I think that there is a concern about potential threats in the future, we've had a few people that have said that they don't feel comfortable doing that, which is concerning and also very hard for making sure that we have enough judges at our polling places. So it's definitely something I think as we get closer to November, we'll see more of. But right now, I mean, I already know of two people that said that they're not coming back for that. And it's not even just a single party. It's like, they were two different parties of the people that said they felt like everything was too polarized and they didn't want to be in the middle of it in case something happened. Yes.
So you talked about the machines, you know, the budget, that to get a $48,000 machine, you had to go through the county.
Yeah.
So does that affect every county, you know, and every election board?
Yes. So every county has to work with their county commission or their legislature. If it's Jackson County and St. Louis County have legislatures. They have their budgetary approval is in their hands. So,
So if all the machines break, you just do paper. You know, I mean, I was a poll worker for the St. Louis City, and all the machines were abysmal, and they would break. And so you'd say, well, you can do paper.
yeah. So, well, in the St. Louis City, I think they required everybody to use touchscreens for a while at some point too. We do not require, and this is different depending on where you go. Some places for early voting, like I don't know if everyone has seen our touchscreen machines, but they're touchscreen and they mark a piece of paper and then they print out and then you still put that into the tabulator. So the touchscreen machine's not counting anything. Some counties, that touchscreen is all that they make available during the early voting period. There's administrative reasons for that. It's cheaper because you're not printing a whole bunch of extra ballots to bring, you know, to the absentee period. But then the voter doesn't have the option of doing hand marked if they want to. So we offer both during early voting. But yes, in counties that have had outdated technology or their equipment breaks or something fails, the failover is usually either, well, we've got a large high-speed tabulator like we do. So cast all the ballots into just a plain box if that machine isn't working, and we will central count them when they get back to our office through that tabulator that we have. Or we could do a hand count if everything was like catastrophically failing. But if we have to get to that point, then we have to go back to the commission and ask for a bunch more money to hire enough people to count all of those ballots.
What's your normal turnout for elections? I mean, what percentage of the registered voters?
Well, so for the April elections, which are the local ones, we get anywhere from 15 to 30%. It's pretty low. Something has to be really compelling to get to that 30% area. So, like I'm thinking for April 2nd, we're probably only going to see 20% turnout. For an August election, that jumps up a little bit more to like 40. If there's something, if there's an initiative petition on an August ballot, sometimes it's more like 50. But then it's the presidential elections where we see 70% of voters turning out. Even in a non-presidential year like November of 2022, I don't even think we cracked 60% for that. So it really is like the presidential stuff that's driving. A lot of voters only vote once every 4 years.
How do you train for competency in this job? It seems like I'm stress prone, and I don't think there's any way in the world I could possibly do your job. Yet I consider myself a fairly professional person. What was the process for you to become in this role? Were you apprenticed somehow? I mean,
I would love if there was an apprentice program.
Love challenges, I understand.
You in every county.
I can't imagine the HR people trying to make the prerequisites for this job.
Well, and ironically, in most counties, HR is also the county clerk's job. So,
And remember, it's an independently elected office.
yes. So I would say two things. One is that most county clerks don't realize the breadth of the job until they get into it. And so
think so.
sometimes that leads to turnover, because they realize they do not want to do this job, and so they just leave like 2 or 3 months into their term.
Are they mostly women, by the way?
Yeah, so nationally,
Interesting, isn't it?
yeah, nationally, 70 to 80%, the average county clerk, if you're thinking about like the average local election authority, a white woman over the age of 60. That's who the majority of people are that are running elections in the country. It's a little bit different depending on urban versus rural, but the way that when people are talking about like national statistics, they say 80% of the country falls within 20% of the total number of people that run elections. So you got like 8,000 people that run elections in this country, 20% of those people are serving 80% of the country because they're large urban areas. The other 20% of the voters are served by the other 80% of the election authorities. So some of these tasks are, like we still have to do all of these tasks, but they might be on a part-time budget. So it's really hard to say like, well, here's the one manual for how to run elections. And that makes it hard to train people when they come in. So that's where the association, like in Missouri, the association tries to fill that void and kind of mentor people as they come in so that they don't feel overwhelmed. I feel very lucky because I just happen to really like elections enough to work in the Secretary of State's office before, but it by no means gave me any insight into the like detail work of what's in, I just knew what the parameters were and the guidelines for what we had to accomplish, but not necessarily how it all got accomplished until I got into the role.
But you have written an operations manual for your successor?
I have. Yes, I have, because when I came in, there was not one.
I was thinking.
So, yes, I have written an elections manual that I use in the office that it says everything from just like upload that report so that we can use it for something to check this box to make sure that the sample ballots go live. There's literally a button on our website on our end that says, show the sample ballot, yes or no. And when they're ready, I have to move that to yes. So I put that in the manual so that we don't forget to make the sample ballots appear on the website.
Brianna, and we've been very fortunate in Boone County, fortunately forever, that we have really good people below the county clerk that help the new county clerk get acclimated. It's just a terrible thing to say and how we do it. And the county clerk has decided, well, maybe we don't want to do it that way anymore.
Yeah.
But at least the foundation's there.
Yeah, there's a really good foundation.
Are you being called upon to go to other countries and other states to share this, how to build an operator's manual and all these other things? I mean, do you get sort of an activist notion of professionalism?
Yeah, so
You get called upon, not so much for the UN, but whatever, go to Nicaragua, Venezuela and all that.
well, so I was asked to go to Tunisia, which was really interesting, in December of 2022. And the really interesting thing to me about democracy is that the core parts of it, like you still have to count the ballots, you still want bipartisan or 2 sets of eyes on things. That was universal, still universal to most of the most of the countries that have some sort of elections. The professionalization of the job has been something that I think the larger elections community, like there's nonprofits that focus on providing training. There is a national local election authority association. Those groups, since we've had so much turnover in the last 4 years, have been focusing on, all right, let's get some training programs spun up. So University of Minnesota now offers a certificate in elections administration. Auburn University has a CERA designation, which is what I have, which is just Certified Election Registration Authority. So they have a curriculum that they put everybody through to do that. And then from the, like, making sure the office is well-run, managerial perspective and stuff, they are just kind of now starting that conversation of, let's bring together the presidents of the associations from all over all the different states to have a conversation about how we can create like a guidebook that says, make sure that you have operations, make sure that you have a continuity of operations plan, make sure that everybody in the office has some sort of documentation of what they do. And then what they're doing is creating templates so that it's easier for people that have not thought about it before. So that you can walk in and say, if you just fill this form out, it'll be the whole basis of your continuing operations plan, and this is the bare minimum of what you need. So they're trying to do that so that every office at least can have something, instead of,
So
I don't know, we just keep it in our head, it's fine.
does this artificial intelligence, this smart form, scare you, the delegation to this uniformization?
I think there have been some, for the AI side of things, some groups, and I have tested it out and asked AI, like, create me an educational poster on how to vote as a member of the military. And it's pretty good. I mean, you still have to go through and like proof it and make sure it applies to your specific county. But I think there are a number of people in the elections community seeing that it has value for creating those types of things.
Thank you.
And I know there's a bunch of people that were in the meeting chat, and I will get an export of the meeting chat and then provide the answers to it after. So I apologize. I've failed in keeping up with the chat like I wanted to, but.
Thank you, Brianna.
Thank you.
Maybe you can answer them at the beginning of the next session.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna. We'll see everybody again next week.
The next session.
Oh.